Resident Evil 3 Remake is both a giant step forward and backwards, both from its predecessor and from the original Resident Evil 3. Here's why. RE3 Remake on paper follows the spectacular survival horror gameplay model left by its predecessor down to a T. It's a game where you're shuffling through a series of brilliantly designed interconnecting corridors, some wide, some tight, all with secrets to find and warranting coming back to. All throughout, you're on the lookout for various items you need to get from one point to another. You're constantly on edge because you always ever have just enough ammo and recovery items to skirt by, and the zombies remain just as intimidating as ever. They can soak up tons of damage, always necessitating that you shank them again and again just to make sure they're actually dead, and their unpredictable shuffling makes landing shots an actual challenge. I said it with RE2 Make and I'll say it here, there really is no greater sense of dread than trying and failing to land a single hit on a bare basic zombie when its head is constantly lurching away and it's getting closer and closer for that inevitable chomp. Now, a lot of this is just more or less copy and pasted from RE2 Make, and in fairness it is a winning formula. But what gives RE3 Make an edge are the little things it does to differentiate itself. The biggest thing being that you now have a dodge move, one that if timed perfectly gives you a brief window to really rail into any passing enemy. The dodge move goes a long way towards making combat encounters feel far more engaging, especially against Nemesis. You also got fuel drums and generators so you can lure zombies or Nemesis towards to blow them away or zap them long enough for you to either rail into them or run past them. I've always been a huge fan of using your environment like this in video games, because when you can round up monsters long enough to lure them near one of these fuel drums and take them all out in one fell swoop, it's not only deeply satisfying but saves you a great deal of precious ammo. Mechanically, RE3 Remake does exactly what a good sequel should do. Takes what worked about the previous game and builds on that. All the mechanics that made RE2 Make so damn good are all on full display here, and the added combat dodge and environmental advantages work perfectly to make the action more exciting without taking away from the survival horror elements the way games like RE6 did. The game also does away with weapon degradation, so you can slice with your survival knife to your heart's content, which I always opt to do when making sure that zombies are actually dead. Unfortunately, that copy and paste design philosophy is just as much a point against RE3 Make as it is for it. For starters, as far as enemies go, all the zombies are the exact same as the last, right down to the damn character models, and the fact that you know all the tricks to beating them. I knew right away to constantly stab every single zombie I killed so they wouldn't come back to surprise me the way they did in RE2 Make. I knew when the one and only liquor showed up to keep quiet and slow, or just rail into its brain. Yet the game kept acting like this one lone enemy was some big reveal when it wasn't. Even the Paleheads, while unique to the campaign, weren't unique to RE2 Make. They were just reserved for ghost missions for some stupid reason. There are only 3 unique enemies in RE3 Make. Gross fuck-off spiders that are sprouting from the walls of the substation that attack you from any which way and periodically infect you with parasites, the Hunter Gamma, that big fat thing that turns you into a literal Jill sandwich, and the more aggressive hunters with that infuriatingly random one-hit kill attack. The point is that while the new enemy types are welcome additions, there just aren't enough of them to keep things from feeling like you've seen every trick this game has to throw your way far too early in. And once you know every single trick a game has left to offer, it ceases to be scary. Don't get me wrong, this game does build a tense, oppressive atmosphere, especially in the sound design. But there's a difference between feeling tense and feeling fear. Fear comes from the unknown. That when you venture into new, uncharted, darkened territory, some unknown monstrosity could be just around the corner, one you won't immediately know how to deal with. Without that unknown element to keep me on my toes, I just didn't have any reason to feel scared. RE3 Make is a master of tense, haunting atmosphere. But to once again draw on the unknown, so much of the environment is completely interchangeable from RE2 Make. Some parts of the streets see you taking different routes than what was originally available in that game. You even got other areas just straight up completely lifted from the last game, just with stuff not completely fucked. Yes, I know the original game also had you revisiting locations from RE2, but the original is also a longer game with more areas to venture through, more on that later. See, I feel like the more time we spend in strikingly similar locations throughout these games, the more accustomed I get to them. And to reiterate, familiarity is antithetical towards fear. So RE3 Make may make me tense, but it just isn't scary, because nothing it has to offer is any different from its predecessor. Where it differs most is in the action, and fortunately the action of this game is rock solid, which means now is as good a time as any to talk about the true star of this game, the titular Nemesis. This fellow was easily the biggest draw to an RE3 Make in the first place. If Capcom could turn Mr. X Go and Give It To You into this terrifying, relentless beast/meme, just imagine what they could do with this big daddy. And sure enough, the answer is a whole lot. Because whenever Nemesis does show up, god damn does this game come to life. Nemesis does exactly what Mr. X did. He relentlessly pursues you to the end of the earth with the sole desire of repurposing Jill Valentine's face as a punching bag. But whereas with Mr. X, where your only option is to waste a bunch of bullets to stun him or just run, with Nemesis, his active pursuits feel like genuine boss fights. He has a much wider variety of attacks than Mr. X. He has an active weak spot to target, and successful combat dodges allow you to rail into his generator. Best yet, unlike Mr. X, the environment plays a huge part in combating this ugly bastard. He's far deadlier than Mr. X, but the combat mechanics make things feel far more even. So even though he's a deadly, unstoppable killing machine, you can outright confront him, and taking him down feels both satisfying and genuinely fun and tense. Whereas combating Mr. X boiled down to just staying out of range and shooting his face a whole bunch while he did nothing but close range attacks and no reward incentive. Best yet is the way he constantly does what the zombies do not. Whereas you know everything they have to offer, with Nemesis he's constantly evolving. After you give him the slip when it's just him, his fists, and his tentacles, he comes at you with a fucking flamethrower. After that, like the classic RE3, he comes at you with a goddamn rocket launcher, with its own set of mechanics to give you a fighting chance for evading his attacks and laying into him directly. Nemesis has all the challenge and intimidation of Mr. X, with far more variety and excitement in the actual fighting. As a result, each encounter feels fresh, bombastic, yet still tense, without ever feeling tedious. And Ferrari 3 makes many flaws. Mechanically, the way they remade Nemesis for this game is spectacular. His encounters are everything you could ask for. They keep everything true to the original game with the added spice of modern non-tank mechanics, and the end result is some of the best encounters of any Resident Evil boss monster to date. So how many encounters with Nemesis do we actually have? 2. 2 open-ended encounters with Nemesis in a remake called Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. And note my phrasing there, open encounters. As far as scripted linear sequences go, Nemesis is scattered throughout. He's the very first enemy we encounter in a totally linear do as we say or die scenario. His are the only 4 bosses in the entire game. And he shows up periodically to wreck shit in cutscenes that 20 some odd years ago were actual in-game boss encounters. Outside of those, however, him showing up after the power plant puzzle and after the flamethrower boss fight are the only times this relentless hunter is ever pursuing you in the game. That's it. And what happens after the second time? He fucking mutates. From the iconic laser-focused Franken monster you see on the title screen and every single time you load up this game, to a slightly bigger, more generic-looking licker. And once he does change, that's the Nemesis we get for the entire second half of the game, who only shows up in cutscenes, predetermined obey our command QTEs, and 3 boss encounters, 2 of which occur back-to-back. No sense of being hunted, no more awesome pursuits where you gotta use your environment and good timing to lay into this badass brute, 2 encounters, and that's all you get. And it isn't even like Nemesis is a persistent threat in the first half of the game either. He shows up at the very beginning for 2 QTEs, fucks off for a solid hour, turns up after the plant for his big pursuit, then again into subways for a really fun yet brief takedown, fucks off again into tunnels, reappears with a flamethrower after the fact, has his big flamethrower boss fight up top, and then finally turns down with a rocket launcher for the second and final active pursuit in-game. That's all the actual Nemesis you get in this game. Now, I'd ask what the ever-loving pickle fuck the devs were thinking when they made this perfect foil for the player and barely put him in the game, but unfortunately I think the answer is fairly obvious. Either the budget wasn't there or the dev time wasn't there. Bear in mind, RE2 only just came out 14 months ago. And while Capcom now uses its own RE engine for these games, that engine is still relatively new. It's not an annual release generator the way Ubisoft's games tend to be. Games today are a lot harder, more time-consuming, and far more expensive to make than they were 20 years ago. You can't just pump out a full-on, ground-up remake of a game like Resident Evil 3 after only a year since RE2 and expect the same level of quality. And as a result, there's a lot left on the cutting room floor. For starters, in contrast to RE2 there's a notable lack of polish all around with this game. The way zombies turn to stop-motion animations if you're too far away, barely blending into the background. Whereas zombies are no longer programmed to follow you wherever you go, but stop once you move past a certain part of any one room. Texture quality just dips like crazy half the time, so a lot of background assets just never fully load their texture maps. Or the fact that all the zombies are just recycled from RE2 without so much as a single new model to mix up the variety of gruesome foes taking a bite out of your tits. There's also way fewer records to beat for unlockables in the last game, which had roughly 30 records more than RE3, not including the entire sub-records to break for ghost missions, meaning you have way fewer things to work towards for unlocking nifty power-ups, cosmetics, and weapons on subsequent replays. There just isn't remotely as much content put into this game as its predecessor, and rule of thumb is that generally a sequel shouldn't have less content than the last game. And easily the biggest note is that this is a short fucking game. Including cutscenes, I beat the entire game in just under 7 hours. Now bear in mind, I don't think shorter is necessarily a bad thing. I'm glad when a campaign doesn't drag because I'm less likely to get bored. More to the point, I'm far more likely to replay a short game because I know it won't be a time sink. As a matter of fact, I was saying this with RE2 as well. I would have much rather just had the campaign be one singular campaign, where you play as Leon and periodically cut to Claire and Sherry, but only for the parts of the campaign that were exclusively their segments, not constantly replaying the same bits of campaign over and over. So I was really glad that there was only one campaign with Jill and Carlos, and was even gladder that with this being a survival horror game, it didn't overstay its welcome the way RE2 did by making me replay near identical campaigns twice, just so I could shoot a giant blob of shit in the eye for 50 seconds. seconds. But the shorter campaign defense only applies if I'm satisfied with what those few hours of gameplay give me. And if this was just 6 or 7 hours of Nemesis chasing my ass around with an increasing variety of moves, weapons, and more options for me to neutralize or bypass him, laying out traps, going for a hunter-hunted predator scenario in a zombie-infested city, I'd be all set. More to the point, I would actively want to replay the game more and more because Nemesis is genuinely fun to engage with. But that's not what happened. Nemesis mutates way too soon into the game, then drops to the face of the earth until his boss fights. He isn't even actively present enough in the first half of the game when he's still actually Nemesis and not just generic Umbrella Monster 9400. I just didn't get enough open encounters with him to feel like I got my money's worth with Nemesis, proper Nemesis before I shift to a substantially less interesting enemy. And while nothing about this game is ever tedious, unfortunately, nothing is ever as fun as those first few encounters with the big guy. And as a result, I just found myself kind of underwhelmed with the game less than halfway in. That isn't to say the campaign itself was bad. There are still a good few highlights here and there. There's a set piece with Carlos straight out of Call of Duty Zombies mode, where you gotta defend Tyrell and Jill against a swarm of zombies breaching the hospital. And for a brief moment, you can forget all about being conservative with bullets. You can just go hog wild, but you still have generators to help you out and other foils to keep things from ever feeling too lax. I was having a blast with that mode and found myself thinking, man, it's too bad they're in a bonus mode with sequences like these. The hunters themselves are great enemies, really fun to fight though. Again, I hate those random ass fuck you I win throat slash moves they do. And while on my first playthrough I didn't have the weapon needed to actually kill paleheads, pushing them back was both challenging and rewarding to pull off when done right. And while I hate what they did with Nemesis way too early in, all 4 of his boss encounters were excellent. Look, most will agree that the bosses against Birkin and the final fight against Mr. X gonna really give it to you are kinda shit. Because you got this big ass pile of meat and bones slicing at you, and all you can do is maintain a brisk jog, which often left you vulnerable to big attacks. And as a result, these big climactic showdowns often felt sluggish. I liked G2 and G4 well enough since one was more of a puzzle, where you had to stun Birkin long enough to smash his thing-looking ass with a crate, and the other involved blasting into Birkin with a minigun. But the problem with RE2Make's bosses is that the mechanics just weren't there for direct, fast-paced conflicts, nor were any of the fights particularly creative. Nemesis, in contrast, puts all of these fights to shame. You still gotta lay into him, but you actually have the mechanics needed to successfully avoid his attacks, and when timed right, you can dish out some serious punishment. Like G2 Birkin, you have the added benefit of your environment playing a big role in each of his boss fights, none of which ever dragged on. And I love the way they completely redid his final mutation. So instead of just being this weird ambiguous ball of meat and tentacles, he's still that, but he has a much more focused attack pattern and goes through a variety of stages to take down. That, and I just love the way they surprise you with that final fight theme remake from the original game. Seriously, this game's soundtrack is kick-ass. However fun as those fights might be, the best boss fight in the entire game is still Nemesis' first form, when he's still Nemesis, and has a giant flamethrower. That's honestly one of my favorite fights in the entire series, because it has everything I love about a good boss fight, all wrapped into a single encounter. You have a wide variety of options for laying into him, including environmental advantages. Nemesis himself goes through a variety of stages as the fight progresses, even turning his flamethrower into a giant hammer. And the longer that fight goes on, the more fire constantly consumes the rooftop around you. And his open encounters, while not direct scripted boss fights, still account for some of my all-time favorite encounters in the entire series, because they're difficult, highly intense, but also doable, open-ended, and thus deeply fun as a result. See, the moment-to-moment gameplay isn't worse than RE2Make. The problem is that, that's all this game really has after a while. We already got all of the dark, spooky, samey corridors full of the exact same shuffling bullet sponges the last time we played Resident Evil. A sequel is not supposed to give you just more of the same, because if you wanted that, you could just replay RE2Make. A sequel is supposed to build off of its predecessor, and the problem is that while mechanically RE3Make does build on the combat and environmental advantages, that's all in service of more of the same stuff. Not new enemies or new scenarios to put all these new mechanics to their fullest use, or new much of anything. And while Nemesis himself could have been all the game needed to give all these new elements their fair due, Nemesis himself barely factors into the game. RE2Make's biggest weakness was a severe lack of variety, but because the experience was brand new and so refreshingly tense, it was easy to overlook that at the time. But that experience isn't fresh anymore. And given the samey feel between the two games, the fact that a lot of RE2Make's other problems are still just as present here only serves to frustrate even more now that the newness is all but gone. Like how despite the game constantly saying press X over and over anytime you get grabbed by a zombie, you will always get bitten. I hold it, I mash it, nothing happens, except zombies get a tasty bite of my Jill sandwich. If I'm supposed to do something else, fucking say so with the indicators. And don't make it so goddamn archaic, especially when all the other non-bitey indicators work exactly as they should for QTEs. See, the other big thing is that at every other point before his mutation, no matter what I was doing, all I was thinking was, man, I really hope Nemesis shows up soon to chase me around for a bit. My philosophy with video games has always been that a good video game needs to pinpoint exactly which parts are the most immediately entertaining and then deliver as much of that as possible. The original RE3 worked so well because while a lot of its setting and enemies were identical to RE2, Nemesis himself was unique and a bundle of fun every time he showed up, which was why he was a constant presence all throughout the entire game. If Nemesis here is as fun as he is to fight or run away from, then the game needed to have a lot more of him than it actually had. Because whenever Nemesis isn't in the fray, what we're left with is a lot of the same been there, done that. Seen one sewer system, seen them all. Seen one wrecked lab, seen them all. Throw Nemesis into the mix with more weapons and attacks, and he offsets a lot of what starts to feel stale. But without him, what we're left with is a lot of gameplay that, while effective, feels strikingly similar and thus far less entertaining. And it really doesn't help that a lot of what was left on the cutting room floor of the original RE3 helped to bring some of that much needed variety into things beyond Nemesis. From the parks, the clock tower, the graveyard, to that worm boss, even the boss fight with Nikolai, the actual main villain of the game beyond Nemesis. No, instead of dodging his helicopter missiles while you blasted him right back, or Capcom swapping that up in favor of a really cool gunfight like with Krauser, now instead it's this weak-ass Call of Duty non-fight, where all the cool shit happens in a cutscene and all you, the player, do is push a fucking button. Or not. And bear this in mind, I'm not one of those people who automatically hates a remake for being different from the original. In fact, I'm always saying remakes should take more liberties with its source material. Fuck warts in all remakes. Take what worked about the original and improve on it. Build on it. Give us something different. But there's doing something different and then there's just not doing anything at all. And all too often, RE3 Remake does the latter. And what it does do differently in-game often comes at the expense of the experience as a whole, Nemesis being overall absent from the entire game being the biggest red mark. The other is a lack of Mercenaries mode. Resident Evil kind of needs Mercenaries because minus RE4, these games don't really have a lot of replay value. Now granted, RE3 Remake does fare a little better than its predecessor in terms of the campaign's replay value simply because it is so short. And even if there's fewer challenges, completing them is satisfying, and the items they award you with go a long way towards making replays all the more carefree. Best yet is the way everything you do in any save file counts towards the records, whether you save a game or not. Pro tip folks, if you want to get through a lot of these challenges, keep a separate save file for when you have to defend Jill in the hospital as Carlos. I did that just replaying it over and over and hung out when Tyrell kept badgering me to blow the place up. As a result, I ended up unlocking all the infinite ammo weapons and all the coins, which made me stronger, had higher defenses, and regenerate health, making it so I practically never needed any other items beyond the occasional life regen items during subsequent replays. And there is something really gratifying about going back into the campaign tension-free and just blazing through everything and everyone with only 2 guns you'll ever need. So fewer challenges and rewards or not, there is still just enough reward incentive to give the game some replay value. But the underlying question is, what is it all in service of? And the answer is that it's in service of a campaign that only ever really comes to life in a small handful of moments. Otherwise, it's all just consistently fine with too few genuinely memorable and engaging moments in between. I enjoyed it well enough, but outside the Nemesis encounters, it's not a campaign experience I'd ever go out of my way to jump right back into the way I do a lot of other games that I truly love. That's why games like RE4 did so well, because the campaign was pouring with variety and tons of quality, varied boss battles. And once the campaign was finished, you had Mercenaries mode to jump back into whenever you pleased. And that mode alone was one you could sink hours upon hours into just trying to beat your best score, keeping momentum and combos going and staying alive. Not to mention separate ways or ADIS files and all that other stuff. See, again, the logical part of my brain tells me that this is less about creative choices and more about doing whatever one could to have this game out by April of this year. And whatever the case may be, the end result is a game that is mostly just more of the same I already got from RE2 Make. And after the high that is the Nemesis encounters, everything else just feels so much less exciting as a result. Because the knowledge that nothing after that rocket launcher encounter will ever be as fun just kind of dampens the entire experience for me. The game didn't need to be longer. It just needed to have a lot more of this crooked nose looking motherfucker stomping around. Give it more rocket launcher chases, more varied weapons like a machine gun or whatever, and more sequences where you gotta lay out traps to take them down. That's what made RE3 Nemesis such a great game despite its shit controls and shit fixed camera. No, you don't need bad controls and fixed cameras to be an effective horror game. The absolute last thing this game needed less of was the titular Nemesis. Nor did this game need a tacked on co-op multiplayer mode that no one will be playing a month from now. Which I guess means now's as good a time as any to talk about the multiplayer. Spoiler alert, it's shit. The unique side content of RE3 Remake is a mode called Resident Evil Resistance. This is basically a 4v1 co-op survival game. You have survivors, 4 players venturing through 3 corridors worth of puzzles trying to escape the complex, and then you have a mastermind, the enemy player who lays out traps, zombies, and special monsters or abilities to obstruct the survivor at every turn. You can even control some of the monsters from time to time. You have a time limit to reach the goal, gaining time whenever you kill a monster, solve a puzzle, or clear a round, and losing time whenever you get attacked. 4 masterminds, 4 levels, about 8 who gives a shit teenagers, XP boosters, and loot boxes. So on its question, has Resident Evil multiplayer ever not been half-baked dog shit? Because last I checked, none of these games or their modes have ever boded well. And considering how long it takes to get a single match going, I'm willing to wager Resistance ain't faring much better. Because why would it? There's absolutely nothing to this mode, especially since depending on your rank, you could be asked out of luck before a match even begins if you go up against a high-ranking mastermind with better cards. It takes the core idea of basic Resident Evil gameplay, here's a puzzle, here are 3 pieces, go scavenger hunting, but it relies on a mastermind and cooperation to make it truly challenging. And it's a complete crapshoot how that will fare. Does your mastermind have cards and boosters you don't have that give him way more advantages? Do your teammates know what the hell they're doing? Is the mastermind's host connection functional at all? And even if it does all actually work, so the hell what? It's not all that fun even when it does work. It's a unique idea, sure, in the sense that instead of the enemy player being a giant hulking monster, they're just some asshole in a chair spawning giant hulking monster for you to deal with and occasionally operating a fuck-off turret gun. But the weapon system is archaic, the corridors don't always offer the best cover for players going up against gun cams that also have a fucking shield to back them up, and all the cores take way too long to destroy, requiring you to exhaust way too much of your ammo and basically go fuck yourself when up against inevitable gun cams. I don't believe for a second that this was designed with fun on the brain. Anytime a level system requires boosters in any variety, that's when you know something is grindtastic enough that getting through leveling faster becomes all the more appealing. Resistance just feels like another possibly interesting idea that doesn't have enough of anything to give it long-term appeal, especially in today's oversaturated multiplayer market, where if you aren't robust with content and characters, if you aren't interesting and fun out the gate, you're dead on arrival. And I really can't help but wonder why Capcom would bother. If every other failed attempt at some bullshit multiplayer mode is any indication, what shelf life do they honestly expect this boring nonsense to actually have? And if I seem bitter about Resistance, it's because I am. I'm disappointed because this is yet another example of a game that elected to compromise long-term quality single-player content for short-term gimmicky multiplayer that one would have honestly thought the publishers would have given up on this by now. This is the Arkham Origins problem all over again. Who the fuck was asking for a cover shooter in a Batman game? And who the fuck was asking for this garbage? Look, you already have way more popular YouTube personalities and pundits droning on and on about the ethics of these dodgy choices. That's not what bothers me. Every single thing takes effort, and my gripe is that effort was in service of this. That's what you have to remember in every half-baked, tacked-on multiplayer mode. These are resources that could have gone towards the actual core game, the thing you paid $65 for. It could have gone towards giving that more shelf life. Think about all the time, effort, and money that went into making Resistance, a mode that objectively does not have the staying power in its core gameplay or enough content to compete with an ever-increasing variety of far more robust multiplayer games on the market. So wouldn't that effort have been better served complementing RE3 Remake itself? Like making an actual Mercenaries mode more akin to RE4 than RE2 Remake, where you play as Jill, Carlos, Nikolai, Tyrell, Hunk, whoever, going through even some of these inventive levels designed for this pointless gimmick of a mode. Just anything to give a game that's already light on content some much needed meat and replay value. But nope, quality and fun were not on the brain when Capcom pushed for a PvE mode in a Resident Evil game. Those things are never on a publisher's brain when they shoehorn in pointless multiplayer modes in largely single-player focused video games and front-load them with microtransactions. Even if Capcom does patch in the Mercenaries mode down the road, how many people who actually bought this game will still have it installed by then? You only have one first impression to grab a player. You either seize it or you don't. And long term, I just don't see myself coming back to this game for more than a week from now. And I sure as hell won't be coming back to its multiplayer mode either. Which means all that's left is to talk about the glorious B-movie schlock that is this game's writing.
Bitch can't even swim.
The basic premise of RE3 Remake is that Raccoon City has been full-on zombified, and former STARS member Jill Valentine finds herself being hunted down by the deadly Nemesis, a monster man under Umbrella's control with limitless strength and longevity. In her attempt to escape, she befriends Carlos, a soldier from an Umbrella rescue squad, and the two have to work together to stay alive, and what starts as a mission to get people evacuated from the city turns into a larger plan to find a cure for the virus, all while Umbrella seeks to wipe all evidence of their wrongdoing from the face of the earth and using Nemesis to eradicate anyone who still knows the truth about Umbrella's antics. Writing in Resident Evil games has never really been its strong suit, and RE3 Remake feels decidedly more self-aware of how stupid all this mess actually is, and just owns it. There's no attempt to try and build intrigue or play up melodramatic nonsense the way RE2 Remake did. Here are your leads, here's a smarmy asshole villain who is just cartoonishly evil, and here's a really badass monster to act as the main thread of the story until it isn't. In a series as stupid yet grossly convoluted as Resident Evil has always been, one thing I've always loved about RE3 is just how refreshingly straightforward it is. Umbrella bad, Jill Sandwich and Carlos good, Nemesis go stomp stomp. It lends as much context as you need in any given moment, without ever detracting from the core gameplay or growing so convoluted and nonsensical that it becomes steadily harder to keep up with. It's straight to the point, blunt, and much more entertaining as a result. And a large part of that is thanks to the characters themselves. As a character, Jill Valentine kicks the living shit out of Leon and Claire's cardboard cutout personalities in every way. She's been through all this shit already, which makes her dialogue and interactions with other characters that much more entertaining. Carlos is a really likable secondary lead as well. He's an able soldier who, despite being part of an evil corporation, you just trust and like. He's serious when he needs to be, quippy and bad with women when appropriate, and like Jill, has a fun personality, where he takes all the horror seriously, but exudes confidence that he can deal with it all. I believe the growing connection between Jill and Carlos because the two actually have chemistry. They're both really casual together and play off each other quite nicely, but both also take huge risks for the other in ways that feel believable. As far as bad guys go, Nikolai is just a delight. He's so cartoonishly evil that he honest to God puts a paycheck above the fucking world itself. I mean, could be that he honestly believes the virus won't spread beyond Raccoon City, but instead of being some asshole who waxes poetically about rotten meat monsters and world domination, the guy's just a fucking dick. His smarmy personality is on full display from the word go, and he never once even tries to hide it. I mean, you might think I look at this as a negative, but I really don't. If a bad guy is just fun to watch, go for it. And Nikolai is fun to watch. He's the perfect villain for this kind of nonsense story, and I say that as a good thing. He, like the plot itself, is blunt and to the point with his intentions and bears those selfish intentions with pride. I'd say that overall the dialogue has a much more naturalistic feel to it the way RE7 did as opposed to, well, the often choppy and overly bloated dialogue Resident Evil is known for. For the most part, no cutscenes ever really drag on. They're all as long as they need to be to provide as much context as needed, yet the personalities of all the key characters still succeed in making me feel invested, campy and cheesy as they may be. But that said, I never really gave a shit when any of the supporting characters bit the bullet. Brad shows up and immediately gets chomped before I could ever spend enough time with him to give a shit. Mikhail is fun, but he only has 2 scenes before he goes full Air Force One on Nemesis, and Tyrell is also there. What's weird is that towards the end, it feels like the game is hinting that Tyrell might be infected. The way he keeps lurching and groaning, I thought that was building towards him mutating and either turning into a zombie like Brad or some weird boss monster. Instead, nope, Nemesis just tentacle points him to death and that's that. So it feels weird that there's just no payoff to this character whatsoever. He's around, then he just dies. Like, what's the point? Honestly, there really isn't much to say in terms of the writing or story of RE3 Remake, except that the ending kinda sucks. I've always maintained that after any journey, just ending isn't a satisfying note to close on. You need payoff. What's the payoff to the journey that all these survivors went through? What does the world after look like for Jill and Carlos? We don't really get much of anything, in fact. The bomb goes off, Jill has some off-screen monologue swearing to take down Umbrella, and then roll credits. I mean, that's always been a problem with all these games, to be honest. I can't recall a single Resident Evil game that didn't just end after the final boss was dealt with. And that's always been to the game's detriment, because just knowing that the character survived isn't enough. They've been through hell and back. What is their reward for all of that? How did they cope? But to be honest, I can't really be that bothered by it. Writing is the absolute last thing I, or anyone else to be honest, ever plays any of these games for. Everything in the background services the context of what you're doing and why you should give a shit. No more, no less. So the fact that a remake of a game from a historically terribly written series had a story that was neither distracting nor bothered me in the least, and managed to actually be quite fun by not taking itself so damn melodramatically serious all the time is really kind of surprising. And if nothing else going forward, I do hope to see a lot more stories in the same vein as RE3 Remake than RE2 Remake. Cut out the melodrama from characters who have no screen time to warrant feeling invested in, cut the lengthy exposition, the waxing poetic garbage, and just have fun characters with personality going up against cartoonishly evil assholes and making quippy remarks every now and then.
Come on, you.
I gotta be honest, I was really disappointed with this game. I played it in its entirety twice, revisited old save files to replay segments that I enjoyed the most, and at no point outside of resistance mode was I ever really having a bad time. But I guess the problem I have with RE3 Remake is the same problem that a lot of people have with Batman Arkham Origins. It's a lot of the same of the last game we got, but not nearly as new, as refined, and without any meaningful attempts to innovate and keep things from feeling stagnant. Origins offset that by having way more boss fights in Arkham City, all of which were way better by pure happenstance. And RE3 Remake does try to offset that with better combat than RE2 Remake and Nemesis himself, but there just isn't enough of it. I already played RE2 Remake. I was perfectly content with it, but wasn't in love with it the way the rest of the world seemed to be, and I had absolutely no incentive to replay it once it was finished. I didn't play RE3 Remake wanting more of the same. I wanted Nemesis, and lots of him, which didn't happen. I had fun with this game, and when it isn't just Remake again, it's a blast. Replaying it with infinite ammo was a fun way to get back into things in a much faster, more carefree manner, but it didn't make the content itself more enjoyable, or detract from the fact that the best parts of the game are too few in between. This is ultimately a good game, with some truly excellent mechanics, a perfect survival horror model, and great level design on display. But none of that stops this game from feeling stagnant due to just how utterly indistinguishable most of this game's campaign was from Remake. It had the means to not only set itself apart from Remake, but be one of the best games in the series. Capcom had a golden goose in the form of Nemesis, and they really needed to capitalize on that, and unfortunately they didn't. And the end result is a game that's consistently fine, with moments of tense greatness, but also overshadowed by a lot of samey gameplay that just doesn't have the same effect that it did last year. It's more of the same with glimpses of something far better, too few in between. That might work for you, and if so, great, but Remake as a whole just didn't work for me. And so my final rating for Resident Evil 3 Remake is a 6 out of 10. Nothing about this game is unenjoyable or tedious to get through. It's effective enough in the core of survival horror game design. Short enough where if you can overlook the overall lack of Nemesis or anything new, you can get through the whole thing in a night if you skip cutscenes. And if you have save files all before Nemesis' key encounters or Carlos' tower defense, there's plenty of replay value in those sequences alone. This is a game that took a number of steps in building on Remake, but at every chance it had to do something meaningful with those new steps, it didn't. It opted instead to just fall back on its comfort zone with far less of everything. So as I said at the very start of all of this, one giant step forward, one giant step back. Basically, the long short of this whole thing is if you're going to do a remake of RE3 Nemesis, have more fucking Nemesis! Anyway, those are my thoughts. Do you agree? Were you okay with the way Capcom handled Nemesis? Whatever your opinions may be, let me know in the comments. If you like this review and want to see more, please consider subscribing or to take my thumbs. And yes, I know my Fan and Pain review is taking for goddamn ever, but that's because it's going to be my longest video review I ever make. So don't be surprised if you see other reviews up before that one. Anyway, thanks for watching, and can we all agree that nothing is ever not improved by giant lasers?